I was standing on my own front porch when my son told me I was no longer allowed inside. It was a Wednesday, I think, late afternoon. One of those dry Arizona days where the heat lingers in the concrete long after the sun begins to drop. The brass doorknob reflected the light so sharply it almost looked white. I remember that detail clearly, though I can't say why. Maybe because the grocery bag in my hand had already started to cut into my fingers, leaving a red line across the skin. I had been gone for 9 days, not very long, just enough time to recover from a minor procedure at my sister's house in Mesa. Nothing dramatic. The doctor had called it routine, and I suppose it was. At my age, people use that word more and more often. Routine, preventive, manageable. Words designed to keep everyone calm. Andrew had insisted I shouldn't come home alone right away. He said he would handle the house while I rested, water the plants, collect the mail, check on things. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I had one overnight bag, a paper sack with groceries, and my purse over my shoulder. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always had. Same trimmed hedges, same pale stucco houses warming in the afternoon sun. The flag across the street moved slowly in a light breeze. Nothing about the street suggested that anything inside my life had shifted. Then I noticed the doormat was gone. A small detail, maybe. Brown choir mat with blue stitching around the edges. I bought it myself 8 years earlier at Lowe's. It had sunflowers on it, cheap and cheerful, a little faded from the sun. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the empty rectangle of concrete where it used to sit. Then I slid my key into the lock. It didn't fit. Not the way a stubborn lock sometimes resists when the weather changes. This was different. The key simply didn't belong there anymore. The entire cylinder had been replaced. I tried again more slowly. Behind me, I heard blinds shift. Not mine. Mrs. Alvarez from next door. She had lived there almost as long as I had. A quiet woman, careful with her words. The kind of neighbor who notices everything but rarely comments on it. The blinds moved slightly, then settled again. That was when I heard footsteps inside. Slow, unhurried. The door opened 3 inches, held by the inside latch. Andrew stood there, wearing a grey polo shirt I had never seen before. He held the door the way someone holds it when speaking to a salesperson they intend to dismiss quickly. Behind him, I could see the entry table had been moved. My blue glass bowl, the one I kept for keys, was gone. In its place sat a tall beige vase that definitely did not belong to me. He didn't say hello. He looked at me, then at the grocery bag in my hand, then at the suitcase by my feet. "Mom," he said evenly, "you should have called first." I blinked at him, still trying to catch up with the moment. Some part of me believed there must be a reasonable explanation just 1 sentence away. "My key isn't working," I said. He glanced briefly at the lock. "Yeah, I had the locks changed." He said it casually. The same tone someone might use to mention replacing a smoke detector. Behind him, I heard Cheryl's voice. "Is she here?" She appeared a moment later in the hallway, arms folded, her expression already irritated. Her lipstick was brighter than usual for the middle of the day, and she had that particular look some people wear when they believe they've already predicted your reaction. Andrew opened the door a little wider, though not wide enough for me to step inside. "We've talked about this," he said. "No," I replied calmly. "You've talked. I've listened. That's not the same thing." He exhaled sharply. The strange thing about humiliation is that it rarely arrives all at once. It comes in layers. First confusion, then disbelief. Then a quiet hope that maybe you misunderstood. Then one sentence lands clearly, and everything rearranges itself. Andrew glanced past me toward the street. He lowered his voice slightly. "This isn't working anymore, Mum. You need more support than this house allows." The line sounded rehearsed, carefully constructed. Not "we're worried about you," not "let's talk," just language polished. until it no longer sounded like a son pushing his mother out of her own home. I set the grocery bag down gently on the porch. Inside it were yogurt cups, bananas, a loaf of soft wheat bread, and the tea I usually buy at Safeway. One of the yogurt lids had cracked during the drive. I could smell strawberries faintly through the paper bag. "Where are my things?" I asked. Cheryl answered before Andrew could. We boxed up what was important. What was important, that phrase stayed with me. I looked past them and noticed 2 cardboard boxes stacked near the dining room archway. Brown packing tape, thick black marker labels. One of them read, "Winter linens." The handwriting wasn't mine. Andrew said, "We're trying to make this easier." The room inside me went quiet then. Not the street. The street still had normal sounds. A dog barking somewhere down the block. A car rolling slowly past. A sprinkler clicking through its rotation. But inside, something cooled. Some people mistake silence for permission. I didn't say that out loud then. I only thought it. Later, I realized that moment mattered more than I understood. Andrew had spent years confusing my patience with surrender, my quiet with weakness, my reluctance to argue in public with an inability to act. It was a very old mistake. I asked one more question. "Did I sign anything?" He hesitated. Just long enough. Then he said, "We're handling it." Not an answer. A procedural person notices those things. Missing details, unclear language, the sudden appearance of "we" in a situation that should only involve one person. I looked again at the new deadbolt, bright satin nickel, installed neatly. I looked at the unfamiliar vase on the table, then at Andrew's hand holding the door, and I understood 2 things at once. First, this had not been impulsive. Second, he believed I would respond like a mother, not like the legal owner of the property. That distinction mattered more than he realized. Behind me, Mrs. Alvarez opened her front door halfway. "Elena," she called softly. "Do you need me?" I turned toward her. Her face suggested she understood the shape of the situation, even if she didn't know the details. I smoothed the front of my blouse before answering. Pale green cotton, slightly wrinkled from the drive. "No," I said quietly. "Not yet." Andrew shifted his weight. "Mom, don't do this out here." I almost smiled at that. Out here, meaning visible, witnessed, inconvenient. I picked up my grocery bag, then my suitcase. My hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of keeping my voice steady. "You should be very careful what you do next," I said. Cheryl gave a small, dismissive laugh. Andrew's expression hardened. "We're past that point." Maybe he believed that. Maybe he needed to. I looked at him for a long moment and saw something I had been avoiding for months. Not cruelty exactly. Something colder. A kind of entitlement disguised as confidence. The kind that grows when someone repeats a story long enough that it begins to sound like authority. I nodded once. Then I stepped off my porch. Not quickly. Not dramatically. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't push my way inside or create a scene in front of the neighbors. There are moments when emotion helps. And there are moments when procedure serves you better. This was a procedure moment. By the time I reached the sidewalk, I had already made my first decision. I wasn't going to beg my son to let me into a house that was still legally mine. I was going to verify every document, every access point, every assumption he had made. And, if he wanted authority, I would let him meet the version that arrives in writing. I walked to the end of the block before I allowed myself to stop. There was a narrow strip of shade beside the community mailbox. Not enough to cool the pavement, but enough to stand still, without feeling watched from every window. I set the grocery bag down on the curb and checked my phone. 2 missed calls from my sister. 1 automated reminder from the pharmacy. Nothing from Andrew. That detail stayed with me longer than it should have. If someone has just locked his mother out of her own house, You might expect a second thought, a text message, some small attempt to soften the moment. There was nothing. I called my sister first. Her name is Marlene. She's 3 years older than I am, practical in a way that has saved both of us more than once. She answered on the second ring. Elena, you home? I looked down the street toward my house. The front door was closed again. The blinds had shifted slightly. Not exactly, I said. There was a pause. What does that mean? I gave her the short version. Locks changed. Andrew inside, Cheryl there. I hadn't been allowed to enter. Marlene inhaled slowly. I could picture her standing in her kitchen, one hand resting on the counter while she processed what I had just said. Do you want me to come over? She asked. No, I said. Not yet. That phrase had already started to form in my mind. Not yet. It gave me room to think. So, what are you going to do? I looked down at the keys in my palm. House key, mailbox key, the small silver key for the filing cabinet in my study. Keys to a structure that no longer matched the locks they belonged to. I'm going to find out what he thinks he's done, I said. Marlene didn't argue. She had seen me handle enough difficult situations over the years to recognize the tone in my voice. All right, she said finally. Call me when you know where you're staying tonight. I will. I ended the call, picked up the grocery bag again, and walked back toward my car. It was still parked where I had left it 9 days earlier, beneath the jacaranda tree across the street. Andrew had asked me to leave it there because he said the garage opener had been acting up and he needed space to organize things. At the time, I didn't question it. Looking back, it was one more small displacement, one more adjustment that seemed harmless until you saw the larger pattern. The inside of the car smelled faintly like dust and peppermint gum. I sat there with the door closed and the engine off, my hands resting on the steering wheel. There are moments when people expect a strong emotional reaction, crying, shouting, confrontation. But that isn't how my mind works. Instead, I began sorting. Certain betrayals are loud in memory, raised voices, doors slamming, words that echo afterward. This one felt different, administrative. That was what made it dangerous. If someone screams, witnesses remember. But when someone speaks calmly about safety, support, and arrangements, people hesitate. They assume there must be details they don't understand. I suspected there were details. I simply didn't trust whose version of them had been circulating without me. I drove about 15 minutes to a Hampton Inn near the freeway, a place close to a medical plaza and a bank branch I had used years earlier. Clean enough, neutral enough. The lobby smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and recycled air conditioning. A young man at the front desk looked up briefly from his computer. Checking in? He asked. Yes. He typed for a moment and slid a key card across the counter. Just one night. For now. Room 214. Breakfast ends at 9. Normal life continued quietly around me. The elevator chimed. Someone wheeled a suitcase across the lobby floor. A woman in scrubs asked the desk clerk for extra towels. I carried my things upstairs. Inside the room, I placed the grocery bag on the desk and pulled the curtains halfway closed. The comforter had one of those geometric hotel patterns designed to offend absolutely no one. Blue and tan shapes repeating across the fabric. I washed my hands in the bathroom sink, poured myself a glass of water, and sat on the edge of the bed with a small legal pad from my purse. Then I wrote 3 questions. Did I sign anything? Who had access to the house documents? Who changed the locks? It might sound cold to reduce a situation like this to questions so quickly. But emotion without sequence usually leads to exhaustion. I learnt that years ago. The first memory surfaced while I was writing. 6 months earlier, Tuesday evening. My kitchen. Andrew was standing barefoot by the refrigerator, eating pistachios from a small bowl I usually kept for guests. The overhead light hummed faintly. He looked around the kitchen and said, This house is too much for one person. I had been drying a plate with a dish towel. The towel smelled faintly of detergent and rosemary because I kept a small herb pot on the windowsill above the sink. It's exactly enough for the person who owns it, I said. He laughed. You know that's not what I mean. At the time, I let the comment pass. Later, I realized that moment mattered more than I understood. Back then, he still framed everything as concern. Yard maintenance, safety, too many rooms, too many stairs, though the house had only 2 shallow steps at the front entrance. He and Cheryl had developed a whole vocabulary around relocation. Easier, simpler, responsible. Pressure doesn't always arrive as force. Sometimes it arrives disguised as planning. I picked up my phone and called the non-emergency police records line, not because I expected them to solve anything immediately. I simply wanted to understand how situations like this were handled. A woman answered. Her voice sounded efficient and unsurprised. If there's a property access dispute, she said, officers can respond to keep the peace. They don't determine ownership on the spot unless documentation is clear. What kind of documentation? I asked. Deed records, identification, property tax notices sometimes help. Title matters most. I wrote that down. That was when something shifted. Because once the structure was spoken out loud, I stopped thinking like a mother in conflict and started thinking like a property owner dealing with access, interference. I ended the call and opened the county recorder's website on my phone. The Maricopa County portal isn't elegant, but it works if you know what you're looking for. Name search, parcel number, transfer history. The page took a moment to load. The small spinning circle lingered longer than I liked. Then the record appeared. Owner of record, Elena Navarro. No transfers filed, no lien changes, no recorded conveyance. I sat very still. Outside the window, someone laughed in the parking lot. A car door slammed. The hotel air conditioner hummed louder as it kicked on again. The house was still mine. That certainty brought another memory. My husband, Luis, in the garage workshop 15 years earlier. Sawdust on the floor. A small radio playing quietly on a shelf. Andrew had been standing nearby watching him tighten the leg on an old oak table. A house teaches you who you are, Luis said. Andrew rolled his eyes. It's just property. Luis smiled slightly. No, he said. It's responsibility with walls. I could almost smell the sawdust again. Luis has been gone 8 years now. Some days I remember his sentences before I remember my own. He understood structures, buildings, finances, even families. I called my bank next. Not to move money yet, just to confirm whether anyone had attempted changes to my primary account. After answering a few security questions, the representative checked the records. No external changes, she said. No new authorized users. Any verification requests? I asked. She paused while typing. There was one inquiry yesterday through a mortgage verification platform, but the application wasn't completed. Mortgage verification. I sat up slightly. Do you know which institution? I can't release that without a formal request. But I already understood the direction. Someone had tested the financial lane. I wrote the words down on the pad. Mortgage verification inquiry. 2 evidence steps in a row. The pressure beat followed almost immediately. My phone buzzed. A text from Cheryl. Please don't create a scene. We're trying to do what's best. I read the message twice. Not, are you okay? Not, let's talk. Just narrative control. I took a screenshot and forwarded it to Marlene. Then I called the attorney who had helped me after Luis died. His name is Paul Drennan. He answered on the 3rd ring. Elena, he said, how are you feeling? Legally, I said, or medically? He gave a small breath that sounded almost like a laugh. Sounds like legal first. Yes. I explained the situation. Locks changed. Son inside the house. Title still in my name. Paul didn't interrupt. When I finished, he asked only one question. Did you sign a power of attorney recently? Yes. Limited medical authorization during recovery. Do you have your copy? In my study filing cabinet. In the house? Yes, he paused. All right, he said. Then we move carefully. Those words stayed with me. Move carefully. He scheduled a meeting for the next morning and told me exactly what to bring. Identification, utility records, insurance documents, property tax notices. Let the file speak, he said, before we ended the call. That night, I gathered every document I could find in my email and printed them in the hotel business center. The printer jammed twice. A teenage boy beside me kept apologizing while trying to print airline boarding passes. Take your time, I told him. By then it was evening. The coffee in the lobby had gone bitter. My back ached from sitting too long. But the structure of the situation had started to become visible. The title hadn't moved. Someone had attempted a financial verification. And Cheryl was already trying to manage the story. That was when I understood something clearly. Andrew believed possession plus narrative would create authority. But possession is temporary. Title is structural. I slept poorly that night. Around 6:40 the next morning, I sat by the window drinking hotel coffee when my phone buzzed again. A message from Mrs. Alvarez. Elena, I thought you should know a moving truck came last weekend. Small one. They carried boxes through the garage. Locksmith came Tuesday. I read the message twice. One question answered. Another one opened. Planning, not confusion. I replied, Thank you. Please don't discuss this with them. Then I added one more question. Did you notice the locksmith company name? Her reply came quickly. Sun Valley Lock and Key, white van, orange letters. I wrote the name down. And by the time I left for Paul's office that morning, I had made my second real decision. I was no longer trying to understand whether Andrew had crossed a line. I was preparing to document how many lines he believed he could cross before someone stopped him. Paul's office sits on the third floor of a modest brick building near downtown Phoenix. It's the kind of place people rarely notice unless they have a reason to be there. A small brass directory in the lobby lists the tenants, 2 accountants, an insurance adjuster, and Paul's firm. I arrived 10 minutes early. The receptionist recognized me immediately. She had been there years ago when Luis and I came in to finalize some estate documents. Mrs. Navarro, she said kindly. It's been a while. Yes, I replied. It has. The waiting area smelled faintly of paper and coffee. Legal offices often do. A quiet place where time tends to move slowly while decisions accumulate in files. Paul came out to greet me a few minutes later. Same calm posture I remembered. Grey suit. Reading glasses balanced halfway down his nose. Elena, he said, shaking my hand. Come in. His office window faced a row of palm trees along the street. The morning sun reflected off the glass of nearby buildings. Traffic hummed faintly below. I placed the folder of documents on his desk. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he sat back and studied my face for a moment. You slept? He asked. Enough. He nodded, satisfied with that answer. All right, he said. Let's go through this slowly. He opened the folder and began sorting through the papers. Driver's license, utility bill, insurance policy, property tax statement. Each document slid quietly across the desk as he reviewed it. The process had a rhythm to it, methodical, unhurried. Finally, he looked up. Title is still in your name, he said. Yes. No trust amendments? No. No transfer filings? No. He leaned back slightly. Then the legal structure hasn't moved. Those words settled something inside me. Structure matters. He continued reviewing the documents. After a few minutes, he said, Tell me exactly how the locks were changed. I explained what Mrs. Alvarez had told me. The moving truck, the locksmith on Tuesday. Paul wrote the company name down. Sun Valley Lock and Key. That's useful, he said. Why? Because locksmith companies keep work orders. He picked up the phone on his desk and dialed a number. When someone answered, his tone shifted slightly. Professional, neutral. Good morning. This is Paul Drennan calling from Drennan and Holt. I'm confirming a service order at a residential address on Tuesday of this week. He listened quietly. Yes, the address is correct. Another pause. Who authorized the lock change? He looked at me briefly as the person on the other end responded. I see, he said. Then he hung up. What did they say? I asked. They confirmed the service. And? They were told the homeowner requested the change. Which homeowner? He tapped his pen lightly on the desk. Your son? I absorbed that information slowly. Did they ask for proof of ownership? No, Paul said calmly. Locksmiths often rely on verbal confirmation if someone appears to have access to the property. I thought about Andrew standing in the doorway the day before. Confident. Relaxed. Certain the situation belonged to him. Paul closed the folder. All right, he said. Now we move to the next step. He stood and walked to a bookshelf behind his desk. A thick property law volume rested on the second shelf. He opened it carefully and flipped through several pages. Then he read a short paragraph aloud. Unauthorized exclusion of a legal property owner constitutes interference with possession. He looked up. In simple terms, he said, someone prevented you from entering your own house. That sounds accurate, which means we treat this as a civil access issue first. He sat back down and began, outlining the sequence. Step 1. Confirm ownership documentation. Done. Step 2. Request peaceful access restoration. And if they refuse? He paused briefly. Then law enforcement can assist with civil standby. The phrase sounded almost clinical. Civil standby. A procedural presence, not dramatic. Just structure entering the situation. Paul continued. I'd prefer you not confront them alone again. I wasn't planning to. Good. He printed several documents and placed them neatly into a new folder. These confirm your identity as the property owner, he said. Driver's license copy, tax record, and county title record. He slid the folder toward me. Bring these when you return to the house. When? He checked his watch. This morning. I felt a small shift in the room. Until then, everything had been preparation. Quiet gathering of facts. Documents lining up in order. Now the structure was beginning to move. What happens if they refuse again? I asked. Then the officers present will explain the situation. And if Andrew argues? Paul smiled faintly. Procedure rarely argues. That line stayed with me. He picked up the phone again and dialed another number. This time the call was brief. When he hung up, he said, I've requested a civil standby unit to meet you at the property. I looked at him. Today? Yes, his voice remained steady. The sooner the structure appears, the less room there is for improvisation. That sentence reminded me of something Luis used to say when repairing things around the house. If you tighten the frame first, the rest of the pieces have fewer places to shift. Paul stood and handed me the folder. Bring this, he said. What about the locks? If they've changed them, he replied, you'll replace them. Immediately? Yes. He paused for a moment before adding something else. People often assume confidence equals authority. He gestured toward the documents. But authority usually lives in paperwork. I placed the folder into my purse. Outside the window, a delivery truck rolled past the building. Someone on the sidewalk below laughed loudly into their phone. Normal life continuing again. Paul walked me to the door. Call me when you're there, he said. I will. I stepped into the hallway, feeling strangely calm, not relieved, Not angry, just focused, because by then the situation had moved from confusion to procedure. Andrew believed possession had already decided the outcome. But institutions don't recognize possession alone. They recognize documentation. And documentation had begun to gather quietly on my side. By the time I reached the parking garage, the first patrol unit had already confirmed their arrival window. 10:45 a.m. Civil standby. That phrase echoed in my mind as I started the car. Andrew still thought this was a family disagreement. He hadn't realized the situation had already entered the institutional phase. And once that happens, the tone of the story usually changes. The drive back to my neighborhood took about 20 minutes. Phoenix traffic was already thickening by then. The kind of slow, late-morning flow where everyone seems slightly impatient, but nothing actually moves very fast. I remember watching the long chain of red brake lights ahead of me and thinking how ordinary everything looked. If someone had passed my car at that moment, they would have seen nothing unusual. Just a woman in her late 50s sitting quietly behind the wheel, one hand resting on a folder of paperwork. Nothing dramatic. No one would have guessed that by noon the police would be standing in my front yard. Paul followed behind me in his own car. We had agreed that was the best arrangement. He would arrive as counsel, not as a shield. Lawyers tend to function better when a situation looks procedural rather than emotional. When I turned onto my street at 10:42 a.m., the neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had the day before. Mrs. Alvarez was watering her rose bushes. Across the street, a delivery van sat half on the curb. Somewhere down the block, a leaf blower was running, that constant mechanical hum that fills quiet suburban mornings. I parked 2 houses down instead of pulling into my driveway. That choice mattered. Walking the rest of the distance gave me a moment to observe. The garage door was closed. The living room blinds were angled downward the way Cheryl preferred them. The ceramic heron statue near the porch had been moved slightly 6 inches to the left, maybe. My husband had placed that statue years ago, and he had been strangely precise about where it belonged. Small changes often reveal confidence. Andrew believed he had time. Paul parked behind me and joined me on the sidewalk. He carried only his briefcase and that same neutral expression he wore in his office. "You ready?" he asked quietly. "Yes." We waited another minute while the patrol car approached. At exactly 10:59 a.m., a Phoenix police cruiser turned slowly onto the block and parked behind Paul's car. 2 officers stepped out. One looked to be in his mid-40s, calm posture, measured movements. The other was younger, scanning the street with the alert. Curiosity officers tend to develop over time. The older officer approached first. "Morning," he said. "Who's the property owner?" I raised my hand slightly. "That would be me." He nodded once. "You the one requesting civil standby?" "Yes." Paul introduced himself and handed over the folder of documents. The officer flipped through the pages without rushing. Driver's license, property tax record, county ownership printout, insurance declaration. Each page quietly confirming the same fact. The younger officer glanced toward the house. "Anyone inside?" "My son and his wife," I said. "And they're refusing entry?" "They changed the locks." The older officer closed the folder and handed it back to me. "All right," he said calmly. "Let's talk with them." We walked up the driveway together. The sound of gravel beneath our shoes seemed louder than usual. Mrs. Alvarez had turned off her hose and was now adjusting the sprinkler head a little too carefully. Across the street, another neighbor had stepped out onto his porch. The social lane was opening. Public space has a way of sharpening situations like this. The officer knocked firmly on the door. Once. Then again. Footsteps inside. The latch moved, and the door opened halfway. Andrew froze the moment he saw the officers. Behind him, Cheryl appeared almost immediately. Her expression shifted from irritation to alarm in less than a second. "What's going on?" Andrew asked. The officer's voice remained steady. Sir, we're here to assist the property owner in regaining access. Andrew blinked. That's not necessary, he said quickly. This is a family matter. The officer gestured slightly toward me. She's listed as the legal owner of the residence. Andrew's eyes moved to me then. For a moment, he looked genuinely surprised. Not angry, not defensive, just caught off guard by how quickly the sequence had advanced. You called the police, he said. I requested assistance restoring access to my home. Cheryl stepped forward. Officer, she's not well, she said quickly. We're trying to manage things responsibly. There it was, exactly the narrative Paul had predicted. Health concern, caretaker framing. The officer didn't react. He simply said, Ma'am, the property records show her as the legal owner. Andrew tried again. You don't understand. She agreed we'd handle things while she recovered. Paul spoke for the first time. Temporary medical assistance does not grant property control. Andrew looked from Paul to the officers and back to me. And who are you? He asked. Her attorney. That single word shifted the room slightly. Attorney. The lawyer looked up and paused. Andrew laughed once, sharp and brief. This is ridiculous. The younger officer stepped a little closer to the doorway. Sir, he said evenly, if you've changed the locks on a property you don't own, that creates a problem. Cheryl folded her arms. We were protecting her. From what? The officer asked. Neither of them answered. The silence stretched across the porch. Across the street, someone's garage door opened. A dog barked somewhere down the block. The leaf blower stopped abruptly, probably because its operator had noticed the police cruiser. Social pressure rising. Andrew made one last attempt. He looked directly at me. You're embarrassing yourself, he said. That sentence might have worked 10 years earlier, back when family reputation felt heavier than documentation. But that morning, something inside me had already cooled into clarity. I answered calmly. You can't take what was never yours. The line seemed to land harder than the police presence. Andrew's jaw tightened. The older officer nodded toward the doorway. Sir, we're going to need you to step aside so the owner can enter. Cheryl's voice sharpened. We live here. The officer didn't argue. He simply repeated the instruction. Step aside. For a moment, I thought Andrew might refuse. Then he looked past the officers and noticed the neighbors, watching. Mrs. Alvarez, the couple across the street, the delivery driver still sitting in his van. The social lane tightening again. Andrew stepped back slowly. The officer pushed the door open fully and gestured toward the entryway. Ma'am, you can go inside. I crossed the threshold of my own house, with 2 officers behind me, and my attorney standing quietly near the porch. Inside, the changes were immediately visible. The entry table had been replaced. The couch in the living room had been turned to face the opposite wall. Several framed photographs were missing from the mantel. Boxes lined the hallway. The younger officer looked around. Looks like you've been busy, he said to Andrew. Andrew didn't answer. Instead, he watched me as I walked slowly through the living room. I wasn't searching for anything specific. I was simply observing. Because every movement inside that house told part of the story. And somewhere in those details was the next piece of Andrew's plan. The financial lane had already surfaced. Now the social lane had opened fully. Neighbors watching, police present, narratives collapsing. And standing there in the middle of the living room, I realized something Andrew still hadn't understood. The structure of authority had already shifted. He just hadn't recognized the moment it happened. I stood in the middle of the living room for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the room the way it had been rearranged. When you live in a house long enough, you develop a kind of internal map of it. You know where the sunlight falls at certain hours. You know which floorboard gives a faint creak near the hallway closet. You notice immediately when something is slightly out of place. My house felt displaced. The couch had been rotated toward the television wall. Cheryl's preference, not mine. Louise had always liked the couch facing the windows, so the room felt open to the yard. The rug had been rolled halfway back, as if someone had been preparing to move furniture again. Several framed photographs were missing from the mantel. My blue ceramic bowl for keys was gone. The younger officer noticed the boxes stacked near the dining room. "You moving, sir?" he asked Andrew. Andrew didn't answer right away. Cheryl did. "We were reorganizing." The officer gave a small nod, but said nothing more. Officers in situations like this rarely challenge explanations unless they need to. They observe. Observation becomes report. That was when the situation began tightening. Paul stepped just inside the doorway and spoke quietly to the older officer. "I'd recommend she replace the locks immediately." The officer nodded. "Ma'am, do you have a locksmith coming? I can call one." Before I reached for my phone, something occurred to me. Sun Valley Lock and Key, the same company Andrew had used. I dialed the number Mrs. Alvarez had given me. The young man answered quickly. "Locksmith services." "This is Elena Navarro again," I said calmly. "I need a lock replacement at the same address you serviced Tuesday." There was a brief pause. "Yes, ma'am," he said carefully. "We can send someone within 40 minutes. "Good." I ended the call. Evidence action. Then the pressure arrived almost immediately. Andrew laughed. "You're really doing this?" I turned toward him. "I'm restoring access to my property." Cheryl shook her head slowly, as if the situation itself were unreasonable. "This is unbelievable," she said. Behind us, the officers remained where they were, still and quiet. They weren't there to mediate family emotions. Their job was simply to prevent the situation from escalating. Andrew walked toward the kitchen. "You can't just walk in and pretend nothing happened." I watched him open the refrigerator like the house belonged to him. That small gesture told me more about his thinking than any argument could have. Some people believe possession creates legitimacy. Institutions rarely agree. The older officer cleared his throat gently. "Sir," he said, "this situation is pretty straightforward." Andrew turned toward him. "No, it isn't." The officer kept the same calm tone. "She owns the house. You changed the locks. She asked us to assist with entry. That's the extent of our involvement." Procedure cooling the room again. Andrew rubbed the back of his neck. "You don't understand what's going on here," Paul answered, before the officer could respond. "We understand exactly what's going on." Andrew looked at him with open irritation. "And who are you again?" "Her attorney." The word landed the same way it had on the porch. Attorney. For the first time, Andrew's posture shifted slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough that his shoulders lowered a little. Cheryl spoke quickly, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Look, we were trying to help. Elena shouldn't be living alone anymore. We were making arrangements." Paul didn't argue. Instead, he asked a simple question. Did she sign any transfer documents? No. Did she grant property authority? No. Then the arrangement doesn't exist. Silence followed. Across the street, the delivery van finally pulled away, but two neighbors had drifted closer to their front yards. One pretended to check his mailbox while glancing toward the house. Social pressure tightening. Andrew stepped closer to me. "You're making a huge mistake." At the time, I didn't answer. Later, I realized that moment mattered more than I understood. Andrew still believed the conflict was emotional. He hadn't realized the structure had already moved past that stage. A few minutes later, the locksmith van rolled slowly onto the street. White van, orange letters, Sun Valley Lock and Key. The same young man I had spoken with earlier stepped out carrying a toolbox. When he saw the police cruiser in the driveway, he hesitated for a moment. "Morning," the older officer said. "Morning," the locksmith replied. I stepped forward. "I'm the homeowner. We need a lock replacement." The locksmith looked briefly at Andrew. then at the officers, then at the documents in my hand. "Okay," he said. "Procedure confirmed." He opened his toolkit and began removing the deadbolt Andrew had installed only 2 days earlier. The sound of the drill echoed across the porch, metal turning, screws dropping into a small tray. Andrew watched in complete silence. That was the moment everything shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but structurally. Because once the lock came off the door, Andrew's claim to control disappeared with it. The locksmith held up the removed deadbolt. "Standard replacement?" he asked. "Yes." 10 minutes later, the new lock was installed. The younger officer handed me the new keys. 3 small pieces of metal, simple objects. But in that moment, they carried the weight of the entire legal structure behind them. Andrew looked from the keys to the officers to Paul. His voice sounded different now, less certain. "You can't just throw us out," Paul answered calmly. "She hasn't." Andrew frowned. "What?" "She restored access," Paul said. "What happens next depends on whether you cooperate." Andrew's breathing had changed by then. Shorter, faster, confidence beginning to shift toward panic. The officer stepped forward slightly. "Sir," he said, "this would be a good time to gather your belongings and leave peacefully." Cheryl's face turned red. "This is insane." The officer didn't argue. He simply waited. Procedure rarely raises its voice. It waits until the structure becomes obvious. And standing there on my porch, watching the locksmith pack his tools and the officers remain quietly in place, Andrew finally began to understand something he hadn't expected. Authority doesn't come from speaking first. It comes from the structure behind the door. And that structure had already chosen its side. Andrew stood very still after the officer spoke. It wasn't the stillness of acceptance. It felt more like calculation. The kind of pause people take when they realize a situation has moved beyond the version they had rehearsed in their minds. You could almost see the sequence running behind his eyes. Police present, attorney present, new locks installed, neighbors watching. The structure had shifted faster than he expected. Cheryl spoke first. "You can't just force us out like this." The older officer didn't raise his voice. "No one is forcing you out, ma'am," he said calmly. "But you can't remain here without the owner's permission." The word permission lingered in the air longer than the rest of the sentence. Andrew looked at me again. For the first time that morning, there was something different in his expression. Not anger, not arrogance, something closer to uncertainty. "You're really going through with this," he said. I held the new keys in my hand and answered quietly. "I already have." He looked past me into the living room, then toward the hallway where the boxes sat stacked against the wall. That was when another layer of the situation became visible. They hadn't simply been reorganizing, they had been preparing. Several of the boxes had labels on them that I hadn't noticed earlier. Kitchen, closet, office files. That detail mattered. Later, I realized that moment mattered more than I understood. Andrew had believed the timeline belonged to him. But timelines change quickly when institutions become involved. The younger officer spoke again. "Sir, we'll give you a little time to collect personal belongings." Andrew didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked slowly into the living room and sat on the couch that had been moved earlier that week. Cheryl remained near the doorway, arms folded tightly across her chest. Paul stood beside me quietly. He leaned slightly closer and said under his breath, "This is the tone shift." I understood what he meant. The performance phase was ending. Now came procedural compliance. Andrew finally spoke. "We need somewhere to go." The officer nodded once. "That's something you'll have to arrange." Andrew exhaled slowly and stood again. He walked toward the hallway where the boxes were stacked. Cheryl followed. For the next 20 minutes, the house filled with the quiet sounds of movement. Closet doors opening, tape peeling from cardboard, footsteps moving back and forth across the hallway floor. No one raised their voice. The officers remained near the front door, occasionally glancing toward the street, where a few neighbors still lingered outside their houses, pretending to check mailboxes or adjust garden hoses. Social pressure was doing its quiet work. Andrew carried the first box out to the driveway. Cheryl followed with two smaller ones. Neither of them looked at me. The process continued like that for a while. One box, then another, then two suitcases. Normal life has a strange habit of returning even while something important is ending. Around noon, the street had grown quieter again. The delivery van had left. Mrs. Alvarez had gone back inside. The leaf blower down the block started up again. The younger officer checked his watch. "You almost finished?" Andrew nodded. "Yeah." He walked back into the house one final time and returned with a small framed photograph. Luis standing beside the ceramic heron statue in the garden years earlier. Andrew looked at the picture for a moment before speaking. "I figured you'd want this." The gesture surprised me. Small gestures sometimes appear late in conflicts like this. Sometimes they're sincere. Sometimes they're simply an attempt to recover a little dignity. I took the photograph. "Thank you," I said. That was the first time either of us had spoken without tension since the morning began. Andrew seemed like he might say something else. Instead, he shook his head once and walked toward the car. Cheryl was already inside. The engine started. The car backed slowly out of the driveway. Neither of them waved. The police cruiser remained parked for another few minutes, while the officers finished writing their notes. The older officer approached me again. "Everything look okay here now?" "Yes. If anything else comes up, you can call the station. I appreciate your help." He nodded politely and returned to the cruiser. A moment later, they were gone as well. Just like that, the house was quiet again. The front yard looked exactly the same as it had a week earlier. The ceramic heron statue still stood beside the porch. The jacaranda tree still cast the same shadow across the driveway. From the outside, nothing had changed. But inside, the structure of the situation had shifted completely. Paul closed his briefcase. "Clean resolution," he said. I exhaled slowly. "Yes." He looked around the living room once more. "Do you want me to file a formal notice preventing future access claims?" "That would be wise." He nodded. "I'll handle it this afternoon." Then he left as well. For the first time that day, I was alone in the house again. I walked slowly through each room. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and cleaning spray. The hallway boxes remained stacked against the wall. The office door stood half open. The filing cabinet exactly where I had left it. I opened the drawer and found the power of attorney copy resting where it should be, unchanged. Outside the front window, the afternoon sun had shifted toward the west side of the street. Everything looked ordinary again, and that was the strange part. Because the entire situation had started with one simple assumption. Andrew believed silence meant permission. But structures don't operate that way. Ownership is quiet. Documentation is quiet. Authority is quiet. But when those things align, they settle questions very clearly. Later that evening, I made tea and sat on the couch facing the windows, the way Luis always preferred. The room felt familiar again, calm. Procedural conflicts often end like that. Not with shouting or dramatic closure, just a quiet confirmation that the structure has returned to where it belongs. Some people mistake silence for permission. Eventually, they learn the difference between silence and patience. And patience, when it's supported by the right structure, usually finishes the story. If stories about quiet boundaries resonate with you, you're welcome to stay. There are many ways people discover where authority truly lives. That day, it lived in 3 small keys resting quietly on my kitchen counter.